This video is a materials video. I'm going to look at the adhesive methyl cellulose. I'll start by demonstrating how I mix up methyl cellulose. My standard mix is 4%, and that's 4% by weight. Water is 1 gram per milliliter. It has a specific gravity of 1. So if you mix up 100 milliliters, a 4% solution by weight would be 96 milliliters of water and 4 grams of methyl cellulose. So I'm going to mix up a 200 milliliter batch. So I'm going to double everything. So I need 8 grams of methyl cellulose and 192 milliliters of water. I've put 150 milliliters of water in the jar, and then I'll measure out the remaining 42 milliliters in the measuring cylinder. Methyl cellulose can also be dissolved in ethanol or isopropyl alcohol if you have a very specialist application where you need to minimize the amount of moisture that you're introducing. 1 level teaspoon is about 2 grams if you don't have a set of scales. Thinking of dissolving in ethanol, it did cross my mind you could make a special bookbinder's hand sanitizer using methyl cell. Add a couple of drops of oil of cloves for aroma. I'm not being serious. It'd leave a sticky residue. Now I'm going to take the jar to the kitchen and zap it for 1 minute on high, so the water is close to boiling. Now I'll add the methyl cellulose to the hot water and then add the 40 milliliters from the measuring cylinder to start to bring the temperature down. It'll still be above the temperature where the methyl cellulose will gel, but I won't have to wait as long for it to cool. I've been told by many people that it's unnecessary to heat up the water and that they mix the methyl cell in cold water all the time and that their adhesive is just as good as mine. I've just noticed that on Talas's website it says the powder mixes easily with cold water. So I will mix up a batch with cold water so we can compare the two. For the cold water batch, I'm just going to mix up 100 milliliters since I don't use that much methyl cellulose, and I'm probably not going to use this batch anyway. Now, I'm just being super geeky when I measure the methyl cellulose with this super accurate scales and the measuring cylinder for the water. 1 level teaspoon is 2 grams, and any measuring jug that you have in the kitchen is perfectly acceptable for measuring the water. 100 milliliters is fine instead of 96 milliliters. So you can see I've added the powdered methyl cellulose to the cold water, and it looks significantly different to the hot water batch. Now, the hot water batch, you have to keep stirring it as it cools down. I'll keep stirring each of these every few minutes until the hot water batch gels because it's gone below the temperature where it sets. I'll have a heap of links in the description of this video to more information about the use of methyl cellulose. There'll be some links to the American Institute for Conservation, which has some really good information in the book and paper group about using methyl cellulose and the properties of methyl cellulose. Now, my son tells me I shouldn't trust Wikipedia. However, there is a really good section on methyl cellulose that I'm willing to believe, and I'd like to read it. It says, methyl cellulose has a lower critical solution temperature, LCST, between 40 and 50 degrees C, At temperatures below the LCST, it is readily soluble in water. Above the LCST, it is not soluble, which has the paradoxical effect that heating a saturated solution of methyl cell will turn it solid, because methyl cell will precipitate out. Then I skip a bit about polar hydroxyl groups, but then it goes on to say, preparing a solution of methyl cell with cold water is difficult, however. As the powder comes into contact with water, a gel layer forms around it, dramatically slowing the diffusion of water into the powder. Hence, the inside remains dry. A better way is to first mix the powder with hot water so that the methyl cell particles are well dispersed and so have a much higher effective surface area in the water, and cool down this dispersion while stirring, leading to the much more rapid dissolution of those particles. And that matches exactly what I just saw trying to mix the methyl cell into the cold water. The powder would just form lumps, and it was difficult to disperse those lumps. So I'm going to leave the two overnight and see what they look like the next day. I always mix methyl cell up a day before I'm going to use it. So the next day, the 4% mix that was done in hot water is quite clear. There's only a few very tiny bubbles. Now I'll quickly compare the viscosity to my standard mix of paste. So it's sort of roughly the same viscosity, maybe a little more runny. Now we'll look at the cold mixed methyl cell, and it's full of bubbles. I think all the powdered methyl cell has finally dissolved. However, my experience is that those bubbles will never go away. It may not be a big deal, but I much prefer to do the hot mix. The most common way I use methyl cellulose is in mix. Now I mix slightly more EVA or PVA with the methyl cell. Now I normally don't use a jar with marks on the side. I just try and eyeball it, and I normally just try and add a bit more EVA than the methyl cell. Though since I've put the marks on this jar, I think I'm going to continue to use this jar. And it's just a matter of mixing it really well till they're well combined. What I haven't talked about is when to use methyl cellulose. You can use it any time that you would have used starch paste, except it has the huge advantage of not going off. And that's why I like it with mix, because I don't use mix an awful lot, and I hate wasting all the EVA. Now I'm just going to demonstrate some different uses of methyl cell and compare it to other adhesives. The first thing I want to demonstrate is the different open times for PVA, mix and methyl cell. So I'm going to stick a piece of paper on a piece of grey board using each, and then see what it's like to pull the paper off the grey board. Now the idea is that mix, you get the advantages of both the PVA and the methyl cell. So methyl cellulose has a reputation for being a weak adhesive, but it has a long open time, whereas the PVA is a strong adhesive, but it keys very quickly. So if you make a mistake, you can't reposition something. So let's have a look at this. Now, as you can see, with the straight PVA, you messed up the piece of paper, but with the mix, you could live with that, and with the straight methyl cell, then you had heaps of time to reposition it. Now I want to explore the idea that methyl cell is the weakest of the adhesives that bookbinders use. So I'm going to stick both book cloth and paper to a piece of grey board using all the adhesives that I normally use, and then I'm going to stick them to each other, to each other as well, and then I'm going to try and pull them apart. I'm going to try and measure how much force is required, but it's not very scientific. I am a a trained scientist, and this does not meet the scientific test. As a YouTube video, of course, it's completely acceptable, and as my son has reminded us, don't believe everything you see on the internet. And it turns out these small overlapping joints with all the adhesives ended up being stronger than the cloth. The cloth tore in every single case. The next test was also a failure, as the scales weren't sensitive enough to be able to measure a difference or anything, but I could tell that the methyl cell was the easiest to pull apart. I thought the last test was the most interesting. Both the mix and the EVA, the joint was stronger than the grey board, so they just caused the grey board to delaminate, whereas the joint with the methyl cellulose was quite weak and it did just pull apart, except for the paper one. We'll see that right now, which did pull the grey board apart. And then finally with the paste, that was quite strong, but not as strong as the PVA for the cloth. But with the paper, it caused the paper to delaminate instead of the grey board, which indicated that the paste had actually penetrated into the grey board and made it stronger. I hope you've found this video useful, and as always I appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button, and if you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button, and until next time, cheerio.